A bull begged a man for help. What he did shocked everyone. The massive Brahman bull collapsed onto its knees in the middle of the dried-up creek bed, its enormous head bowing so low that its nose touched the cracked red earth. Tom Henderson had seen plenty of strange things in his 43 years working cattle stations across the Northern Territory, but nothing had ever stopped him dead in his tracks like this moment. The bull's dark eyes locked onto his, and in them was something Tom had never witnessed in an animal before, a desperate, unmistakable plea that seemed to transcend the barrier between species. Tom had been driving his beaten-up Toyota Ute along the boundary fence of Willowra Station, checking water troughs during one of the worst droughts the region had seen in decades. The temperature had hit 46 degrees by midday, and the landscape looked like something from another planet. Endless stretches of rust-colored dirt, skeletal trees reaching toward a bleached sky, and the constant buzz of flies that never seemed to leave you alone. He'd been about to turn back when he spotted movement in the distance. Down in what used to be Granger Creek, before 3 years without proper rain had turned it into nothing more than a scar in the earth. The bull was huge, easily weighing over a ton, with a distinctive grey coat that was matted with sweat and dust. Its hump rose prominently from its shoulders, and even from a distance, Tom could see the animal was in serious trouble. He grabbed his wide-brimmed hat from the passenger seat, pulled on his work gloves, and climbed out of the ute into the oppressive heat. The metal of the door handle was so hot it nearly burned through the leather. As Tom made his way down the embankment, his boots sliding on loose stones, he kept his eyes on the bull. Normally, a bull this size would be incredibly dangerous, especially if it was injured or distressed. Tom had seen blokes get trampled, gored, and worse. His own brother had spent 6 weeks in Darwin Hospital after a run-in with an aggressive bull back in '98. But something about this animal's behavior was completely different. It wasn't showing any signs of aggression, no snorting, no pawing at the ground, no threatening movements. Instead, it remained perfectly still on its knees, watching Tom approach with those impossibly expressive eyes. When Tom got within 10 meters, he could see the problem. The bull's right front leg was caught in something, an old piece of barbed wire fence that had been washed down the creek during the last flood season, years ago. The wire had wrapped around the leg multiple times, cutting deep into the flesh. Blood had dried in dark patches along the limb, and the area was severely swollen. Tom could see flies clustering around the wound, and his stomach tightened at the thought of how much pain this animal must be enduring. "Easy there, mate," Tom said quietly, his voice carrying across the still air. "I'm not gonna hurt you. Let's have a look at what we've got here." The bull made a low, rumbling sound deep in its chest, not aggressive, but almost conversational, as if responding to Tom's words. Tom had worked with cattle his entire adult life, had handled thousands of head across dozens of properties, but he'd never experienced anything quite like this. The bull seemed to understand that Tom was there to help. Tom circled slowly, assessing the situation from different angles. The wire was twisted tight, and it had clearly been there for at least a day, maybe longer. The bull must have stepped into it while searching for water or feed, and then panicked when it realized it was trapped. The more it had struggled, the tighter the wire had become, until the animal had no choice but to stay put or risk tearing its leg apart completely. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, and Tom could feel sweat running down his back, soaking through his shirt. He pulled out his mobile phone, but there was no signal out here. There never was. The nearest help was back at the main station, over an hour's drive away, and by the time he got there and back with assistance, this bull might be dead from heat stress, dehydration, or infection from the wound. Tom looked at the bull's and the bull looked back at him. In that moment, something passed between them, an understanding, a contract of sorts. Tom made his decision. "All right, big fella," he said, moving closer. "We're going to do this together, you and me. But I need you to trust me, and I need you to stay calm. Can you do that? The bull's ear twitched, and it released a long, slow breath through its nostrils. Tom took that as agreement. He went back to his ute and retrieved his toolkit, heavy-duty wire cutters, his first aid kit, a bottle of antiseptic wash, and a couple of old towels he kept for emergencies. He also grabbed a jerry can of water and a bucket. His hands were steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. This was going to be dangerous, no matter how calm the bull appeared. One wrong move, one moment of panic, and Tom could end up with a crushed ribcage or worse. As he approached again, the bull shifted slightly, adjusting its weight but remaining on its knees. Tom knelt down in the dirt beside the trapped leg, feeling the heat radiating up from the baked earth. Up close, the injury looked even worse than he'd initially thought. The wire had cut through the skin in several places, and there were signs of early infection. The bull would need proper veterinary care, and soon. "This is gonna hurt, mate," Tom said softly. "I won't lie to you about that, but we'll get through it." Tom positioned the wire cutters at the first strand. The tool felt heavy in his hands, and he was acutely aware of how close he was to the bull's massive head and powerful horns. One quick movement, one moment of fear-driven reaction, and this rescue attempt could turn into a tragedy. He took a deep breath, said a quick prayer to whatever was listening, and squeezed the handles. The wire snapped with a sharp ping that echoed across the empty creek bed. The bull flinched, but didn't move away. Tom worked quickly now, cutting strand after strand, carefully pulling the wire away from the damaged flesh. Blood began to flow more freely as the pressure was released, and Tom could hear the bull's breathing become more labored. The pain must have been excruciating, but still the animal remained perfectly still, trusting this stranger with its life. After 15 minutes of careful work, Tom had removed most of the wire. Only one final piece remained, deeply embedded in the swollen tissue. This was going to be the worst part. Tom positioned himself carefully, bracing one hand against the bull's leg while holding the wire cutters with the other. The final strand of barbed wire had worked its way deep into the tissue, creating a groove that had filled with dried blood and dirt. He would need to cut close to the wound, which meant getting his hands right into the infected area. The risk of the bull kicking out in pain was enormous, but there was no other way. "Last one, mate," Tom whispered. "Just hold on for me." He positioned the cutters and applied pressure. The wire resisted at first, then suddenly gave way with a metallic snap. The bull's entire body tensed, muscles rippling beneath its grey hide, and it released a bellow that seemed to shake the very air around them. Tom threw himself backward, landing hard on his backside in the dirt, certain that he was about to be trampled. But the bull didn't stand. Instead, it turned its massive head toward Tom, and in its eyes was something that looked remarkably like gratitude mixed with exhaustion. Tom sat there for a moment, his heart hammering in his chest, dust settling on his sweat-soaked clothes. Then he pushed himself back up and approached the bull again, this time with the bucket of water and antiseptic. The wound was now completely exposed, an angry red mess of torn tissue and swelling that made Tom wince just looking at it. This bull was tough as nails to have survived this long with an injury like that. He poured water over the wound, washing away the worst of the dirt and dried blood. The bull trembled but didn't pull away. Tom then applied the antiseptic wash, knowing it would sting like hell, but also knowing it was necessary to prevent the infection from spreading further. The bull's breathing became rapid and shallow, but still it held perfectly still, as if it understood that Tom was trying to help despite the pain. Once the wound was as clean as Tom could get it with his limited supplies, he wrapped it carefully with the towels, creating a makeshift bandage that would at least keep the dirt out until proper veterinary care could be arranged. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, years of experience showing in every movement. When he was done, he sat back on his heels and looked at the bull. "Now comes the hard part, mate. We need to see if you can stand." Tom stood and took several steps back, giving the bull space. For a long moment, nothing happened. The bull remained on its knees, its head hanging low, and Tom began to worry that the animal had been down too long, that its muscles had seized up from the heat and stress. He'd seen it happen before. Animals that went down in weather like this often couldn't get back up, no matter how much you tried to help them. Then slowly, the bull began to shift its weight. It extended its good front leg, testing it, then started to rise. The injured leg trembled as weight was placed on it, and Tom could see the pain written in every line of the animal's body. The bull swayed dangerously, and for a moment Tom thought it would go back down. But then it steadied itself, standing on all four legs, though clearly favoring the injured one. Tom felt something tighten in his throat. This bull was a fighter. It had survived who knows how long, trapped in this dried-up creek bed, in temperatures that would kill a man in hours, with an injury that would have sent most animals into shock. And it had done something Tom still couldn't quite wrap his head around. It had asked for help. "Good on you, mate," Tom said, his voice rough with emotion. "You're tougher than you look." The bull took a tentative step forward, then another. Its gait was uneven and painful to watch, but it was moving. Tom went back to his ute and retrieved the jerry can of water. He poured it into the bucket and carried it back to the bull, setting it down a safe distance away. The bull limped over and drank deeply, its tongue working the water with desperate efficiency. Tom poured another bucket, and then another, until the jerry can was empty. While the bull drank, Tom pulled out his satellite phone from the locked box in his ute. Unlike the mobile, this one worked anywhere, though the calls cost a fortune. He dialed the number for Willowra Station's main office. "Sarah, it's Tom. I'm out at the old Granger Creek site. I need you to get Doc Morrison out here as soon as possible. I've got an injured bull that needs proper treatment." The woman on the other end asked questions, and Tom explained the situation as best he could. She promised to get the vet mobilized within the hour. Tom thanked her and hung up, then turned his attention back to the bull. The animal had finished drinking and was now standing in what little shade the creek bank provided, its eyes half closed against the harsh sunlight. Tom could see the exhaustion in every line of its body. He went back to the ute once more and grabbed his emergency tarp, setting it up to create additional shade. It wasn't much, but it would help keep the bull from overheating while they waited for the vet. Tom settled himself in the shade next to the bull, keeping a respectful distance but close enough to monitor its condition. He poured some water from his personal bottle onto his hat and placed it back on his head, feeling the blessed coolness against his scalp. The bull watched him with those intelligent eyes, and Tom found himself talking to it, the way he often talked to animals when he was alone on the property. "You know, I've been working cattle since I was 15 years old. My old man had a property down near Alice Springs, nothing fancy, just a few hundred head. He taught me everything about reading animals, understanding their behavior, knowing when they're sick or stressed or angry. But he never told me about something like you." The bull's ear rotated toward Tom, listening. "Most bulls, they'd have tried to kill me the moment I got close. Natural instinct, right? You're hurt, you're scared, you're vulnerable, but not you. Somehow, you knew I could help. Somehow you asked for it." Tom paused, thinking about that moment when the bull had first looked at him. It had been like nothing he'd experienced before in all his years around livestock. "My daughter, Emma, she's studying veterinary science down in Adelaide. She's always going on about animal cognition, about how we underestimate what animals understand and feel. I used to think it was just university talk, book learning without practical experience. But mate, after today, I reckon she's onto something." The bull shifted its weight, settling down onto the ground with a heavy sigh. Tom noticed that it positioned itself so the injured leg was extended, taking pressure off the wound. Smart animal. The minutes stretched into an hour, then 2. Tom kept checking his watch, willing the vet to arrive faster, though he knew Doc Morrison had to drive from town, and the roads out here were rough at the best of times. The bull dozed fitfully beside him, occasionally opening its eyes to check that Tom was still there. Each time their eyes met, Tom felt that same strange connection, that sense of mutual understanding that defied everything he thought he knew about cattle. Tom's mind drifted back to a conversation he'd had with his brother Jack years ago, after Jack's accident. They'd been sitting in the hospital, Jack's chest wrapped in bandages, talking about the bull that had nearly killed him. "The thing is," Jack had said, "I wasn't paying attention. I was tired. I was rushing. And I forgot the most important rule. Respect the animal. They're not machines, Tom. They're living things with their own thoughts and feelings. And when you forget that, that's when things go wrong." Tom had taken those words to heart, had built his entire approach to cattle handling around that principle of respect. But even so, he'd always maintained a certain distance, always remembered that these were working animals, not pets. What was happening here today was challenging that boundary in ways he couldn't quite articulate. The sound of an engine broke through his thoughts. Tom stood up, shielding his eyes against the sun as Doc Morrison's four-wheel drive appeared over the ridge. The white vehicle with its distinctive red cross on the side bounced down the rough track, followed by another ute, Sarah from the station office, Tom realized, probably bringing extra supplies. Doc Morrison was a lean man in his 60s, with weathered skin and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He'd been the primary large animal vet for this region for over 30 years, and there wasn't much he hadn't seen. But when he climbed out of his vehicle and got his first look at the bull, his eyebrows rose. "Tom Henderson, what have you gotten yourself into this time?" Tom quickly explained the situation, finding the bull trapped, removing the wire, the animal's unusual behavior. Doc Morrison listened while unpacking his equipment, occasionally glancing over at the bull with an expression that grew more intrigued by the minute. "And you're telling me this bull just let you walk up and cut it free? No sedation? No restraints?" "I know how it sounds, Doc, but yeah, that's exactly what happened." Doc Morrison approached the bull slowly, speaking in low, soothing tones. Tom watched as the vet examined the injured leg, his practiced hands moving over the wound with gentle efficiency. The bull remained calm throughout, though Tom could see the tension in its body whenever Doc touched a particularly sensitive spot. "Well, Tom, I'll be honest with you. In all my years, I've never seen anything quite like this. The wound is infected, and it's going to need aggressive treatment. But the fact that this animal survived as long as it did, in this heat, with this injury, that's remarkable. And its temperament, the way it's allowing us to handle it, that's even more remarkable." Sarah had set up a portable shade structure and was filling water troughs from large containers in her vehicle. She was a practical woman in her 50s who'd worked at Willowra for 20 years, and Tom could see the concern in her face as she watched the vet work. "What's the prognosis, Doc?" she asked. "He'll live. If we can get the infection under control, the leg will heal, though he might always have a bit of a limp, but honestly, that's not what concerns me most right now." "What do you mean?" Tom asked. Doc Morrison stood up, wiping his hands on a towel. He looked at the brand on the bull's hide, a mark Tom hadn't paid much attention to in all the excitement. "This bull belongs to the Tanami Ridge property. That's the Fletcher place, about 80 kilometers north of here. Problem is, I heard through the grapevine that old man Fletcher died about 6 months ago. His son sold off most of the stock and moved to Perth. Far as I know, the property's been sitting empty." Tom felt his stomach sink. He looked at the bull, understanding dawning. "So this fella's been surviving out here on his own all this time?" "Looks that way. Must have wandered off before the sale happened, or maybe got missed in the muster. Either way, he's been fending for himself through one of the worst droughts we've had." Sarah shook her head in amazement. Tom walked over to the bull and placed a hand on its massive shoulder, feeling the warmth of its hide, the steady rhythm of its breathing. "What happens to him now?" Tom asked quietly. Doc Morrison was preparing an injection of antibiotics, his movements sure and practiced. Technically, he's still Fletcher property, which means he's probably part of the estate. The son might want him, or he might end up at auction, or, and this seemed more likely given the circumstances, he ends up at the meatworks. Tom's jaw tightened. The thought of this bull, after everything it had survived, everything it had shown him today, ending up as meat, didn't sit right. It didn't sit right at all. What if someone wanted to buy him? Doc Morrison glanced up, a knowing look in his eyes. I suppose that would be between the buyer and young Fletcher. Though I'd imagine, given the circumstances, the price wouldn't be unreasonable. Injured bull, no clear ownership, cost of treatment and care, probably more trouble than it's worth to most people. Tom nodded slowly, his mind already working through the logistics. He had some savings, money he'd been putting aside for a new ute, but that could wait. The bull shifted beside him, resting its head briefly against Tom's arm in a gesture so gentle, so trusting, that Tom felt his resolve harden into certainty. "Can you handle the veterinary work, Doc? Get him healthy again?" "I can. It'll take a few weeks of treatment, regular wound care, antibiotics. He'll need a safe place to recover, somewhere with good feed and clean water. I've got a small paddock behind my cottage at the station. It's not being used for anything right now. Good grass, tank water, plenty of shade." Sarah smiled, understanding what Tom was suggesting. "You're going to buy him, aren't you?" "I reckon I am," Tom replied. "Seems only right, after what we've been through together." Doc Morrison administered the injection, then applied a proper bandage to the injured leg, much more professional than Tom's emergency wrapping. The bull accepted the treatment with remarkable patience, only occasionally shifting its weight. "I'll contact young Fletcher tonight, get the paperwork sorted," Doc Morrison said. "In the meantime, we need to get this fellow back to your place. I've got a cattle trailer on my property. We can bring it out tomorrow morning, load him up when it's cooler." Tom agreed, and they set about making the bull as comfortable as possible for the night. Sarah had brought enough water and feed supplements to keep him going, and Tom volunteered to stay with the animal overnight to monitor his condition. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the outback in shades of orange and purple, Doc Morrison and Sarah headed back to town. Tom sat in the dirt beside the bull, his back against a smooth rock, watching the colors shift across the endless sky. The temperature was finally starting to drop, and Tom could feel the bull relax as the oppressive heat began to ease. "Tomorrow we'll get you home, mate," Tom said quietly. "You'll have a proper paddock, good feed, clean water. No more wandering around out here on your own." The bull's ear swiveled toward Tom's voice, and it released a soft, rumbling sound that Tom had learned to interpret as contentment. He reached out slowly and ran his hand along the bull's neck, feeling the coarse hair under his palm. The animal leaned very slightly into the touch, and Tom smiled. That night, Tom dozed in fits and starts, waking every hour or so to check on the bull. Each time he found the animal either resting peacefully or watching the stars with those dark, intelligent eyes. Tom had brought a swag from his ute and laid it out near the makeshift shelter, close enough to respond if the bull showed signs of distress, but far enough to give the animal space. Around 3 a.m, Tom woke to find the bull standing, looking out across the empty creek bed. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in silver light, and Tom could see the bull's breath forming small clouds in the cool night air. He sat up, concerned that something was wrong, but the bull seemed calm. After a moment, Tom stood and walked over to stand beside the massive animal. They stayed like that for several minutes, man and bull, looking out at the ancient landscape together. Tom thought about all the years he'd spent working this land, all the cattle he'd handled, all the storms and droughts and floods he'd weathered. But somehow, this moment felt different. It felt important in a way he couldn't quite define. "You knew, didn't you?" Tom said softly. "You knew exactly what you were doing when you got down on your knees and looked at me like that. You chose to trust me." The bull turned its head, and in the moonlight, Tom could see his own reflection in those dark eyes. There was no answer, of course. Bulls didn't speak, but Tom didn't need words to understand the bond that had formed between them. Morning arrived, with the gradual lightening of the eastern sky. Tom made himself a thermos of tea from supplies in his ute and shared a simple breakfast with the bull, grain pellets from the emergency feed Sarah had left. The bull ate slowly but steadily, a good sign that it was recovering its strength. Doc Morrison arrived just after sunrise with his cattle trailer, and Tom was relieved to see that the vet had brought proper loading ramps and padding for the floor. Loading an injured bull was always tricky, but this one seemed to understand what was needed. With gentle encouragement from Tom and careful guidance from Doc Morrison, the bull limped up the ramp and into the trailer. The drive back to Willora Station took over an hour on the rough tracks, and Tom followed behind in his ute, watching the trailer constantly for any signs of distress. When they finally arrived at the small paddock behind Tom's cottage, the bull walked down the ramp with visible relief, immediately heading for the water trough. Over the following weeks, Tom visited the bull every morning before work and every evening after. He cleaned and dressed the wound under Doc Morrison's supervision, administered medications, and simply spent time sitting in the paddock, talking to the animal the way he'd talked to it that first day in the creek bed. The bull's leg healed slowly but surely, the swelling going down, new tissue forming over the wounds. Word spread through the community about what had happened. Station workers would stop by to see the bull that had asked for help, and Tom found himself telling the story over and over. Some people were skeptical, suggesting Tom had embellished the details, but those who saw the bull's unusual temperament, the way it responded to Tom specifically, began to believe. Tom's daughter, Emma, came home from Adelaide for a weekend visit, and Tom took her straight to the paddock. She stood at the fence, watching the bull graze peacefully, and Tom could see tears forming in her eyes. "Dad, this is incredible. Everything you told me on the phone, I thought maybe you were exaggerating a bit. But seeing him now, seeing how he responds to you, this is exactly what we study in animal cognition. This is proof that cattle are so much more complex than most people give them credit for." Tom felt a surge of pride, though whether it was pride in the bull or in his daughter's understanding, he couldn't quite say. "What are you going to call him?" Emma asked. Tom had been thinking about that. He looked at the bull, remembering that moment in the creek bed, that instant of connection that had changed everything. "Granger," he said finally, "after the creek where we met." Emma smiled. "It's perfect. The purchase paperwork came through without complications. Young Fletcher had been relieved to settle the matter for a reasonable price, and Doc Morrison had handled all the legalities. Granger officially belonged to Tom, and Tom found he couldn't quite explain to people why that mattered so much to him. It wasn't about owning the animal. It was about honoring the trust that had been placed in him that day. 3 months after the rescue, Granger's leg had healed completely. There was a slight limp, as Doc Morrison had predicted, but it didn't slow the bull down much. Tom had the option of selling him or integrating him into the station's working herd, but he couldn't bring himself to do either. Granger had earned his retirement, such as it was. Station manager approved Tom keeping Granger in the small paddock permanently. The bull became something of a station mascot, with visitors often asking to see the famous rescue animal. Tom would bring them over, and Granger would approach the fence with that same calm, gentle demeanor he'd shown from the beginning. Tom's mates down at the pub would tease him about being soft, about keeping a pet bull, but Tom didn't mind. He knew what he'd experienced that day in the dried-up creek bed. He knew what he'd seen in Granger's eyes, that moment of communication that transcended the normal boundaries between human and animal. On quiet evenings, Tom would sit on his porch with a cold beer, watching Granger graze in the paddock as the sun set over the endless red earth. The bull would occasionally look up, making eye contact with Tom, and something would pass between them. Recognition, respect, friendship. Tom had learned more about animals, about trust, about connection from that one encounter than he had in 43 years of working cattle. Sarah stopped by one evening with fresh bread from town. She leaned against the porch railing, following Tom's gaze to where Granger stood in the golden evening light. "You know, Tom, what you did that day was remarkable. Not just the rescue itself, but recognizing what Granger needed. Most people would have walked away, called for help, done it by the book, but you saw something in him, and you responded to it." Tom took a sip of his beer, considering her words. "He's the one who did something remarkable, Sarah. He asked for help when every instinct probably told him to run or fight. That takes a kind of courage I'm not sure I fully understand." "Maybe that's the point," Sarah said softly. "Maybe we're not meant to fully understand it. Maybe some connections just are, and trying to analyze them too much misses what makes them special." Tom nodded, watching as Granger settled down for the evening, the bull's massive frame silhouetted against the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring another day of work, of managing cattle and fixing fences and all the practical realities of station life. But tonight, Tom just sat and appreciated the quiet miracle of what had happened, of how one desperate plea from an injured animal had changed his perspective on everything he thought he knew. The stars began to appear overhead, countless points of light in the vast Australian sky, and Tom raised his beer in a silent toast to Granger, to trust, and to the unexpected moments that remind us there's still magic to be found in this hard, beautiful land.